course, for the over 3,000 Yezidis still till today missing, unknown where they are, in captivity or not. I'm very grateful for all of you being here, because that means that the Yezidis are not forgotten, and I'm thanking all of you for helping us today to remember those who we lost 4 years ago.
Thanks, Patty. Hi everyone, thank you so much for coming today. I'm Akila Radhakrishnan. I'm the president of the Global Justice Center, and I'm going to be your moderator today. The Global Justice Center has been working on issues related to the Yezidi genocide since 2015, in particular with a focus on justice for sexual and gender-based crimes. And as Pari just mentioned, this week marks 4 years since ISIS launched their genocidal campaign against the Yezidi community. And since the attack in 2015, thousands have been killed and subject to horrific crimes, including sexual slavery. The community has been forced from their homeland and dispersed around the world, and the fate of over 3,000 Yezidis remains unknown. 4 years on, even as ISIS has lost nearly all of its territorial control, the genocide is ongoing, and the Yezidis are still waiting for any measure of justice or accountability. Ongoing trials in Iraq have solely been under the ambit of the country's anti-terrorism law and have been widely criticized for being rushed, lacking in due process and human rights protections, and for the severity of the sentencing. This includes trials against women and children as young as 9 who were associated with ISIS. One recent step forward was the adoption of Security Council Resolution 2379 in September 2017 by the Security Council, which in an effort to close this impunity gap sets up an international investigative team to support domestic prosecutions. And criminal and retributive justice is, of course, only one part of the picture. Over the past 4 years, the Yezidi community has suffered immense losses and trauma, and for the most part cannot yet return home. This is why today we're going to discuss with these 2 thus far and a third to come, how the international community can support the Yezidi community to achieve justice and move forward, and also feel secure, feel safe, and thrive. And years of experience have shown us that these efforts to be successful, and for these efforts to be successful and sustainable, they must include women. Women have been the face of the Yezidi genocide, but it's not enough to use their stories and experiences to galvanize action. They need to be at the table and at the center of justice, reconciliation, and transition efforts. And so with that, I'm going to quickly just explain how we're going to proceed today, introduce our speakers, and then really turn it over to them. So the speakers are first going to make some initial remarks for about 6 to 8 minutes. Then we're going to move into a facilitated discussion with me. I may ask specific questions of an individual speaker, but I encourage everybody to participate and engage in a discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions from the audience. So first we have Ms. Pramila Patton, who is the United Nations Undersecretary General and the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Sexual Violence in Conflict.
Sorry to be late as a guest. Embarrassed.
Including the high-level advisory group for the global study of the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1325, the advisory panel for the African Women's Rights Observatory within the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and a commissioner on the International Commission of Inquiry into the Massacre in Guinea-Conakry. A national of Mauritius, she has been a practicing lawyer since 1982 and a member of the Honorable Society of Gray's Inn. She also served as an advisor in the Ministry of Women's Affairs, of Women's Rights, Child Development, and Family Welfare of Mauritius from 2000 to 2004. Ms. Patton holds an LLB and LLM from the University of London and a diploma in criminology from King's College, Cambridge. We also have with us here, we're honored to have you, thank you for coming, Ms. Phumzile Mlambo Nguka, who is a United Nations UN Secretary General, Undersecretary General, and has been the Executive Director of UN Women since August 2013. She brings a wealth of experience and expertise to this position, having devoted her career to issues of human rights, equality, and social justice. Prior to the UN, she has worked in government and civil society and with private sector and was actively involved in the struggle to end apartheid in her home country of South Africa. From 2005 to 2008, she served as Deputy President of South Africa, overseeing programs to combat poverty and bring the advantages of a growing economy to the poor with a particular focus on women. She began her career as a teacher and gained international experience as a coordinator at the World YWCA in Geneva, where she established a global program for young women. She is also the founder of the Yezidi Foundation, which supports leadership in education. A longtime champion of women's rights, she is affiliated with several organizations devoted to education, women's empowerment, and gender equality, and holds a PhD in education and technology from the University of Warwick in the UK. And last, we have Hari Ibrahim. Hari is the founder and executive director of the Free Yezidi Foundation, an organization which seeks to help Yezidi civilians in need and raise awareness of their situation. Ms. Ibrahim, who left Kurdistan with her family when she was 3 years old, fleeing attacks by the Saddam Hussein regime, was inspired to start FYF following ISIS's attacks on Sinjar and the Yezidis in August 2014. After the first fact-finding missions to meet with survivors, Ms. Ibrahim understood that FYF would be most effective by providing services and assistance to survivors in IDP camps. She has spearheaded FYF's efforts to establish women's and children's centers at an IDP camp, leads FYF's Justice Project, and conducts general advocacy to promote greater humanitarian and human rights supports to Yezidis. In her role, she has spoken at the United Nations Security Council, the British Parliament, and a number of prominent universities and think tanks in the United States and elsewhere. Ms. Ibrahim has also been active in organizing protests and speaking with media, and recently graduated from law school. She was doing all this actually, on top of everything else. So I'm now going to turn it over to the speakers. You've heard plenty from me, so if we could start with you, Dr. Mohammed.
Well, I'm really glad that you chose to come and host this event here at UN Women today. I want to thank you, Pamela, for making the time to join us. Thanks, Hari, for the work that you do and for your leadership, and of course everybody who is here. So Pamela will make the substantive speech. I just wanted to make because I think we need time also for discussion, so I'm aware of that. But I mean, it's important to underscore the fact that this is the 4th anniversary of the Yezidi genocide perpetrated by the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, also known as ISL, and we remember all those lives that we lost. The important thing about our trust fund and the support that it gives to occasions and organizations like this is the fact that we actually invest in the people who usually are in the forefront, in the front line, whose work could otherwise go unnoticed. The fact that you bring a different face and expression to the discourse in a world where so much fake news and otherwise news is what sometimes dominates the information that we have, makes your work very important. It's important to continue to remember that there are those who are still languishing in refugee and IDP camps as we speak, unable to return to their homes due to unsafe conditions. And of course, most troubling is still the 1,500 women and girls still missing, which are still held in captivity. So occasions like this remind us that we still have a lot of work to do. Women and girls also, as we know, are treated differently and disproportionately affected by the crisis. And when we speak and look at addressing issues of violence against women in all its forms, when we talk about women in this context, all the other violence that we talk about, plus the specific conditions they have, applies. So it makes it even more complex. And I hope that in our discussion we can really apply our minds about the kind of additional efforts that we need to put in our work so that we can relate to the special circumstances of these women. I hope that this relationship between the trust fund and the work that you do can propel and have an impact in the other work that you do in women who find themselves in this situation. So it's just welcome and really to thank you for the work that you do.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Akila. I'm extremely grateful to be here this afternoon. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank UN Women for hosting this event, and to thank Global Justice Center and the Free Yezidi Foundation for their work on Iraq and the way you interact directly with survivors of Daesh. I would like to take this opportunity to commend your very important work. I think the first survivors of sexual violence that I met since taking office, 2 weeks after taking office, I was in Berlin at a conference organized in the German Bundestag on sexual violence as a tool of war. But I had this opportunity to meet with survivors of sexual violence who had benefited from the special quota project of the German government of the state of Baden-Württemberg, and they were Yezidi women. And you cannot imagine how shaken I was after listening to what they went through. So and I pledged to them that I will never leave them alone, and being part this afternoon of this remembrance event is extremely important to me. 4 years ago, I think I have my voice.
Try that again. Try again. Yeah, maybe the maybe. There you go.
Yeah.
I want something safe. Thank you. I mean, as you all know, we're here because 4 years ago, Sinjar was the scene of tragedy. What happened was a genocidal campaign of killings unfolded with rape, enslavement, abductions, which really triggered a massive displacement of civilians, but mainly Yezidi community whose homeland is Sinjar. And I think we will all recall how within days of the attack, many reports emerged of Daesh committing unimaginable atrocities against the Yezidi community, of men being killed or forced to convert, of women and young girls sold at markets and held in sexual slavery by Daesh fighters, of boys being ripped from their families and forced into Daesh training camps, just to mention a few of the atrocities. But what we did not know was that for the women and girls, a different horror awaited. Captured Yezidi women and girls were deemed to be the property of Daesh, openly termed sabaya, or slaves, and sold, traded between fighters or forcibly married. Daesh fighters held slave auctions, both in markets and online, circulating photos of captured Yezidi women and girls with details of their age, their marital status, location, and price. Yezidi women and girls were subjected to brutal sexual violence. And as I mentioned, all those that I met in Berlin in June of 2017, and those that I met this year in Mosul and Erbil reported violent daily rapes by their captors. So that the extreme brutality waged by Daesh against the Yezidi community, especially against the women and girls, represent a very dark moment in Iraq's history, and it must never be forgotten. And I think today is an opportunity for us to remember those thousands of Yezidi women, men, and children who lost their lives, those that you have mentioned who are still missing, and those whose lives have been devastated by Daesh. But I think it's also an occasion to salute the courage and resilience of all those who face these atrocities with bravery. And I still recall how a survivor told me that she told her survivor, and that was her strategy. She told her survivor that she told me that she saw she had just been sold, and she was getting from one car to the other, and suddenly she saw the mirror and she realized how she had lost weight, and she had lost hair, and she immediately told her captor that she was suffering from HIV/AIDS, and he released her. Another one told me that when she realized that her clothes were so baggy that she had lost so much weight, she also pretended to be suffering from cancer, and was released. And many of the women told me how they tried to look as dirty, as disheveled as possible to avoid rape or being resold. I met those in Berlin, and I told you I was very shattered by their stories. But when I went to Erbil and Mosul and met with survivors there, I mean, like it's very hard to describe what I saw. I mean, like I saw women being the equivalent of a living corpse. They are completely devastated, and the majority of them living very difficult and destitute conditions in IDP camps, struggling with the profound distress of not knowing about the fate or whereabouts of relatives still in Daesh control territory. I was extremely shocked when I met with a group of survivors of sexual violence who had been released in December of 2017, and I met them in March. They had not had any medical or psychosocial support. And when I inquired from them as to which camp they were in, and I ascertained that there were facilities by UN Women, UNFPA, and other agencies, and started to engage with them, although it was with a lot of difficulty to engage with them. Then they told me that they explained that they were being confined in their camps by their parents, and that they were extremely scared to seek the very limited services available out of the fear of being arrested, detained, interrogated as intelligence asset, or being treated as affiliate with Daesh. And I think this is something that we really have to discuss, and I see that you want a focus on resolution 2331, 2379, but I think it's critical that we address how it's important to treat them as victims of terrorism and work towards full implementation of these two important resolutions of the Council. And these are people who urgently need medical and psychosocial support, as well as financial and livelihood support to rebuild their lives and those of their children. And I think what we have to bear in mind is that liberating Mosul from terrorist control is, of course, an event of huge significance for Iraq and the region, as it signals the irreversible defeat of Daesh terrorism. But I think it's critical at this maybe rare moment of national unity that it be consolidated through good governance, through service delivery for all, for enhanced security for all, access to justice and reconciliation. And at the same time, reconciliation will not be possible or even sustainable without justice. All the survivors that I met back in Berlin, but I also subsequently went to Stuttgart to really meet with the survivors in their shelters, in their houses. They all want justice as much as those who are in Erbil, in Mosul. They want the perpetrators to be prosecuted, to be convicted for the full range of the atrocities that they have committed. And yet, as you rightly mentioned, Akila, it's a matter of concern that up to now, not a single Daesh perpetrator has been prosecuted for any of the sexual crimes that they have committed. And despite legislative provisions in Iraqi laws criminalizing rape, reconciliation will also not be possible without robust efforts to look for the thousands of missing Yezidis and members of other Iraqi communities and to reunite them with their families. Again, even in Berlin, but also when I was in Erbil and Mosul, the survivors were always raising questions about the missing, so much that I raised it with the Prime Minister and with the Minister of Defense, especially the Minister of Defense, I recall, who turned around and said, but they're not here. You know, they're not in Iraq. So that was his explanation. So for me, finding the missing must be a priority. I just want to say, for those who may not know, that in September 2016, the government of Iraq signed with the United Nations, through my office, a joint communique to ensure accountability for sexual violence as well as delivery of essential services. And since my office has been working, the team of experts and has been doing a lot of work to finalize an implementation plan, which was validated, in fact, when I was there in March of this year. But this year, on the 19th of June, on the International Day on the Elimination of Sexual Violence Against Women, the government of Iraq has announced the establishment of an interministerial committee to implement these commitments. So I will see to it that this committee is promptly established at both federal and regional levels, with representation of survivors from all components of Iraqi society, including Yezidi community.
See a panel with women. UN Women's Executive Director, thank you so much for, I know it's last minute, and SRSG, Patton, you also, Akila, thank you also for many years now for supporting the Yezidis. we as a small minority, we need all the help we can, and I as a Yazidi woman need a lot of support, especially from women organizations. So I'm a Yazidi. In 1991, my family and I, we fled from Saddam Hussein regime. We were picked up as political refugees and started a new life in the Netherlands. I remember on the morning of August 3rd, there was a lot of commotion and everyone was on the phone, and I went to my parents and I said, like, what's going on? Because the day before we had a party, and I said, what's going on? Did someone die or what happened? And they said ISIS entered Sinjar. We already knew, like, months beforehand what ISIS was capable of, who ISIS was and what they were doing to people in the areas. And once we started talking more with our family members who were fleeing towards the mountain, and we heard of the horrible things that ISIS was doing to our people. I lost 19 girls of my family. They were kidnapped. 2 of them came back. Until today, I'm missing 17 women of my family, 21 men of my family. I never stand here or anywhere else just for my family, but I do stand here for all the Yazidis that suffered from a genocide. We are talking about a genocide. It is confirmed that this was a genocide against the Yazidis. And now we're 4 years further. I was very dismayed when I saw nothing on the news those days about the Yazidi situation, because who had heard about the Yazidis? It was unknown who the Yazidis were. Small minority group living in Iraq, religious, ethnic minority. And now I'm very happy that people are talking about the Yazidis, but yeah, it did cost us another genocide. As I myself at that time was a law student, and I just couldn't believe that we have these treaties in place and they're all signed, and after never again we had said, like, okay, never again, and we will prevent these things to ever happen again. And it is so unfortunate. You're a law student and you know, yeah, things go according to law, but they don't. And the genocide was ongoing and is still until today ongoing, because our women and girls till this day are suffering horrible abuses at the hands of ISIS. We as a Free Yezidi Foundation started to register, and I started alone, but now I have an amazing board. We were thinking about how do we deal with the immense trauma, because we had heard about the women and girls that were taken and were coming back. But we also had to understand that our whole community is suffering from PTSD. They all have trauma. Little kids come to our center, and you won't believe it if you see it, but these kids have trouble breathing because they suffer from PTSD. And so the genocide will affect also the children of the Yazidi community, and this long process of not being able to return back home or finish your education or go to school and have fun, missing your family members, not having your father or mother. There's a lot of suicide in the Yazidi community at the moment. Not many people speak about this, but you can go around in the Yazidi community. Why are there so many suicides only in the Yazidi community? And this is an effect of the trauma that our community has. One thing that we really focus on is, like, okay, we're a Yazidi women-led organization. It is very important that the survivors deal with people who can understand them and do not judge them. There's a lot of stigma. I don't care for anyone who says, like, no, we treat the women well, etc. We have a women's center. We hear women, they are afraid, like, Yazidis welcome them with open arms, but there is so much trauma, there is so much that we have to work through. There's so many things that happen, and these women need a lot of help and guidance to go and overcome. I don't know if they ever overcome this trauma, but they do need help and support to go through that. We have a safe place. I think UN and other organizations try to do the same thing. Yezidi staff, but also international experts on the field of trauma. We're very, very happy that the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women is funding our trauma program. We have seen an enormous difference in women survivors who come back out of captivity and who first are just sitting in an unfinished building and don't want to do anything. I had to say, please come to the center, you will change immensely. They didn't believe me after many times saying, come please, and we know your family, I know their families from my family. And so eventually she said, okay, I'll come to the graduation. And she came to the graduation and she said, okay, I'll come for English class. Later on, she built a trust and came to every course, and with a psychologist, constantly individual sessions, group sessions. Now, if you see this young lady, she has changed so much. FYF has hired her. It is true that FYF, we don't publicize constantly. The women just need love, attention, and support to go through this. And now she's earning money she's even earning more than her own brother. So we all can focus on the horrible things that happen, but we also have to focus on their new life that they have to live. Aside from the trauma, which is immense, there is also another part that the Yezidi Foundation and I think many others have to focus on, and that is justice. And I do want to thank the ASG today, Kareem Khan, for coming here and listening to our panel. Terrorism and human rights are two different things. It is true that ISIS was a terrorist organization, but they have committed a lot of violations, human rights violations. It is very important that these crimes against Yezidis carry weight, and until today it is so disappointing that not even one single ISIS member has been held accountable, has been indicted for the crimes committed against the Yezidis. We are talking about genocide, enslavement, crimes against humanity. 4 years have gone and passed by, and there are perpetrators that can be identified, as what the Yezidi Foundation is currently doing, that have committed these crimes. But not even Western countries, like even Europe, even Australia, the British government, having own foreign fighters going to Iraq and Syria, only taking away their passport, is not justice for our people. Only indicting them for terrorism, it's too broad. Who will know that you indicted this person for raping this young lady or killing their parents? It is also, so for our people, overcoming the trauma cannot happen if we do not have justice. Reconciliation, as the SRSG just said, it will not happen if we don't have justice. A lot of Yezidi women and girls are saying that their neighbors were the ones pointing out Yezidis, their neighbors were the ones who would rape them. How can we say to the Yezidi community, go back to Sinjar and live your life again, when we still don't have figured out who joined ISIS and who didn't? So for us, yeah, justice is very important for our people, and I hear from a lot of governments, let's think about returning the Yezidis back to their homes, and so what's the future of the Yezidis, basically? It is very easy as someone from outside to say, like, okay, we'll make Sinjar good again, we'll rebuild it, and then have the people go back to their place and they can start rebuilding their life. As I said, justice is needed, trauma recovery, but that's not the only thing. The Yezidis need security. This can happen tomorrow again. If Yezidis are in between governments and their decisions, and Yezidis as a small religious ethnic minority don't have anything to say in the governments or anywhere, then how will Yezidis try to go and back to Sinjar and live there again? It is very easy to convince people with money or a beautiful future and have them return to where they were. But the promise to make people aware, like promising people security is something that no one does. And I know of many conversations with governments that their option now is to just make sure that Sinjar is rebuilt and bringing back the community to where they were. But I will say in every meeting where I go, if you cannot guarantee my people's safety, my people will stay in those IDP camps. And until today, they are staying in IDP camps, even though we know that they are already have begun starting to rebuild parts of Sinjar. There are still IEDs. There's still no economics, no work. There's still no sight for any future in Iraq. Our people, if you go to the camps, they will just tell you that they don't want to stay here anymore. My father said it in 1991, and he said, we're not going back. His family convinced, please come back, everything will be okay. My father said, no, I'm not going back. Now my people are still in the situation where they cannot do anything. There's no work in the camps. They are displaced after 4 years. Today we should remember those people who are still in captivity, but we should also remember those Yezidis who cannot go back, even if you rebuild Sinjar. Promise of security and safety is very important, and I know that there are a lot of missions from the UN here, from different countries. I hope you can understand that please do not promise my people to go back if there is no security.
So thank you all for your remarks. There's been a lot of different issues that have been discussed, and I think one thing is each of you raised some very important priorities for helping the Yezidi community move forward and achieve justice. And one thing that we see is, it's been 4 years. ISIS is largely defeated, and there isn't a focus anymore. It feels like we're always moving from priority crisis to priority crisis. Our organization has been working in Burma since 2005. And starting in 2005, or earlier, we've been raising issues related to sexual violence and conflict against ethnic minorities. And somewhere around, 2011, as democratic transition started to happen, no one wanted to listen to it anymore. No one wanted to talk about the issue. It was not a priority. And until the recent spate of violence against the Rohingya, that issue has been off of the international community's priority list. So what do you think is necessary to maintain the focus, to get the political prioritization necessary to actually achieve some of what you've all laid out is so essential or important?
Say something. She's clever. And even what I'm saying, I learned from her. No, I think one thing that we probably don't do, we need to do more of, even in the worst time in a crisis, is really to document information that can be used in an inquiry, in a court of law, so that the stories don't fade away. And I think sometimes when we are dealing with a humanitarian crisis, we rightly are just thinking about keeping people alive. And therefore, we erode the kind of evidence we should be documenting so that when we need it, it is there. So I think that it's not a luxury when we actually insist on documentation. And I'm so grateful that, for instance, in the case of the Rohingyas, at the insights given to us by Pramila after she had visited there, she actually made a recommendation which we have followed up for us to do more documentation and to keep that information. And also we actually need the governments that are critical supporters of both addressing the humanitarian situation, the negotiations, if it gets to actually buy into the importance of providing justice and keeping the evidence intact. And we have to be thankful for those people who do pro bono work, as lawyers, etc., who help us in these times of need. Just one. I think there's a few other things, but that one sometimes just falls between the cracks because it feels like it's a luxury when you're having a big crisis and people are dying.
Well, I think that's a very loaded question. I mean, like it's fairly I mean, like a call of the international community to do more. I fully agree with what Unzile has said about the importance of documentation, because I have made my 3 strategic priorities for this mandate. The importance of firstly reversing the culture of impunity into a culture of prevention and deterrence through justice and accountability, and I think I'm very much aligned with the vision of the ESG on prevention, and I think we really have to work on prevention so that what happened in Sinjar 4 years ago never happens again. And I really think that the work must be on focused on prevention. And how do you and when it comes to Daesh, how do you ensure that you defeat, because Daesh has been defeated militarily, but how do you ensure that you defeat Daesh ideology? I think it is through justice and accountability, and that's why my office is really placing the focus on justice. When I was in Iraq, I met with the High Judicial Council and met with the Chief Justice, and I actually confronted him with this, and I said, I mean, I told him how I recall in 2015, for example, when Iraq really wanted to have a strong resolution of the Human Rights Council. The Minister of Human Rights of Iraq was there all day, and he was only talking about the sexual violence and calling Daesh a terrorist monster and giving all the sordid details of the enslavement, of the rape, of the sexual slavery. And I told him, how can you now not prosecute a single case? In fact, his gut reaction was, it's easy to prove affiliation, and that's why we are going. So they went for the easy route. I mean, it's very easy to prove affiliation under the anti-terrorism law of 2006, which carries death penalty, as opposed to sexual violence, to rape. Their law is I mean, that was his explanation. But then I had to sit with him and explain that we're going to lose the historical record. I mean, like if we go on at this rate, because as we are speaking, trials are being expedited in 15 minutes, executions are already taking place. There will be no historical record of what happened to the Yezidi community and other minority groups, because I also met with the Turkmen Shia community, the Christian, and also the Sunni women were as much were also victims of atrocities of Daesh, and I think that's an, and even with the Prime Minister, that was my strong message. And maybe that takes me to I'll take this opportunity to share what the office is doing. Out of concern from my meetings with different religious leaders who turn around without consulting with the women and the survivors to say not a single woman, no woman would be allowed to actually stand up in a court of law and relate their experience of sexual violence, I was quite upset by this. So I actually went back to Germany. When did I go? April, May. I went back to Germany. I went to the state of Baden-Württemberg. I went to a shelter where there were approximately 100 Yezidi women living, and I sat down with them and I said, you had mentioned last year that you want justice. What does justice mean to you? Will you be able to stand up in a court? This is what my team of experts, this is the support that my office and can provide you. And will you agree to that your cases, to report your cases in Iraq and for the trials to take place? And they were all extremely keen. So now the team of experts is really working on this, compiling the cases, which has already been a lot of work has been done by the federal prosecutor, the German federal prosecutor. So we're trying to identify a number of very solid cases that we will be taking as test cases, because there are laws. There is the criminal code, there is a human trafficking act. So we will be that's the focus of the office right now. But of course, there are other issues on which we are working through UN Action Network, and I'm happy that Kunzile is here because I think there's a lot of work to be done on children born of rape, which we did not address. As much as the women, the Yezidi women have been accepted by the religious leader, the Baba Sheikh, but that's not the case for the other survivors of sexual violence. The Turkmen Shia, for example, they were very open, and they told me, no, we do not accept them, and they have integrated other communities. The children will be killed. The Yezidi have not yet accepted the children, and we tried to engage with them on this. They have not accepted the children born of rape. The children do not have a name. The children it's worse than being stateless because they don't even have a name. And I sat with the Prime Minister and we brainstormed on this, and for him this is a huge issue, and my office has commissioned research on this, which we will share very soon with the government of Iraq. The stigma is huge. It's really bad everywhere, but I think it's huge in Iraq, where now we see even women parliamentarians trying to introduce laws in the Iraqi parliament to give incentive to men to marry the survivors of sexual violence. There is the Al-Jafari law that would allow, draft law that could allow a 9-year-old girl to get married, is still hanging there. And it's all being done in the name of protection. And some religious leaders also, they are endorsing this draft law saying, yes, men should be given incentive to marry survivors of sexual violence to protect them. And they even suggested it should be a plot of land, it should be an apartment. And in the bill, there's something about an interest-free loan or a stipend. So forced marriage is another huge issue, and there's a lot of work to be done. And the last point that I want, because you've mentioned the suicide, I think there is a huge gap in terms of provision of mental health, quality of psychosocial support. I recall we were in the office one evening and we received a phone call from the one and only psychiatrist in Mosul, and she told me 22 women have just been released and they are in a semi-comatose state, and she doesn't know how to deal with them, and she needs the help of the office. And then we tried to knock at the door. We knocked at the door of the German mission to see whether they could, under their special quota project. But I think I want to take this opportunity to thank a number of governments who have actually taken members of the Yezidi community, such as the German government and the Special Quota Project, which has been replicated in a number of countries, such as Sweden, Finland, Norway, Canada, Australia. And I think that's extremely commendable, and you cannot imagine how transformative I've seen the. Now I realize when I compare those in Mosul and Erbil and those in Germany, they are thriving in an environment of equality, dignity, and opportunity. They go to university, they are working. It's really incredible.
And so I think something that came up is that justice has often been the focus of the conversations, but perhaps prevention is one that we talk about a little less. And I think it was in the 2017 report on women, peace, and security mentioned that prevention needs to not only be an issue of responding to imminent crisis, but dealing with structural barriers, structural inequality. And on that, SRSU Patton, I was very excited to see that your office assigned a framework of cooperation with the CEDAW committee to actually perhaps build in a better framework for merging conflict prevention, conflict response with addressing some of the core issues that underlie inequality. I think Pari, you've been talking about how the Yezidis don't feel safe because they've always suffered persecution and discrimination in their home country. So what do we need to be doing better to think about this from a prevention perspective, right? We've talked about justice as one component, but what are the other things that need to be prioritized or addressed to make sure that, we don't end up having a conversation about prevention again in 8 years when we're on the verge of conflict?
Well, I don't think we can talk about prevention without addressing the root cause, and here I'm talking generally. We cannot talk about prevention without addressing the root cause of the sexual violence. And I think it's timely that we speak seriously about prevention and take some very serious measures. And I think one of the invisible driver of the sexual violence is really gender inequality and discrimination. And I really think, of course, you have other forms of discrimination. Discrimination on the ground of ethnicity, minority groups, and all that. But I think that's where agencies like UN Women in my office should work hand in hand. I mean, we simply cannot work in silos. And for me, Iraq, all of the countries of my countries of concern, except for Sudan and Somalia, are parties to CEDAW. And CEDAW is extremely the convention is very comprehensive. And when I also take a survivor, another pillar of a strategic pillar priority for the mandate is taking a survivor-centered approach. And again, you cannot talk about justice without addressing access to women's access to justice. You cannot take a survivor-centered approach without addressing not only medical and mental health, but also economic livelihood. Just to give you one example, I was with Umzile and the DSG in Goma, DRC last July. And the camp where the survivors of sexual violence was about to be closed. And their concern was not, the women we talked to, their concern was not about the closure. Their concern was about the microcredit program from which they were benefiting through UN Women, which had transformed their lives. And they were advocating for this project to be sustained. And they articulated it so well that their physical security was so much inextricably linked with their economic security. So that's where the comprehensive approach needs to be. You need to empower women economically, and UN Women amongst, that's why I see huge potential in UN Action Network, which I chair, which comprises 14 UN entities. But I had a meeting with your new ASG a couple of days ago, and really going to reinvigorate this partnership this close collaboration is extremely necessary. And I'm also trying to, because my team of experts work with the military and justice security sector. We cannot train judges, lawyers, law enforcement on archaic law that would allow a girl of 9 to get married, or would allow the perpetrator to marry the victim. So a solid legal foundation is also important. And I'm also working on a framework of cooperation with the working group on discriminatory laws, and that will be very useful and this is work that I've done in the past with UN Women, supporting legislative reform, working on model legislation, the work that UN Women has done on access to justice. So there is a lot of work to be done, but that can be done by pooling all resources together.
Also, I think in the context of the UN reforms, part of the reforms aim to make us work better in a more integrated fashion as different agencies, but also with other partners outside the UN. I think, therefore, probably need to be proactive in identifying opportunities to really consolidate this kind of collaboration, not just in one country and for specific communities, but really create a framework that can demonstrate the value of a coordinated approach and working together by one UN agencies. I'm hoping that what we are doing on Spotlight, which is an initiative to address violence against women, but does not include women in here. So I think we need a version of Spotlight, and I think it could help for us to start I don't want to use the word lobbying, but something where yes, advocating for something like that is actually quite comprehensive, because once you have different stakeholders and different governments, key donor agencies supporting an initiative that is aimed at addressing the root causes, and you're likely to get something that can be sustained beyond just one community, one conflict area, but create a precedent of sorts. And it must be implemented simultaneously in more than one place at a time. So.
And this is also linked to the work of the UN Trust Fund for Women,
yes.
Right? So if you want to talk a little bit about the work that the Trust Fund is doing in Iraq and more generally too.
Specifically in where's the people from the trust funds? You want to speak more specifically? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, well, UN Trust Fund to Violence Against Women has been engaging actively in addressing the needs of women and girls, refugees, and minorities in the context of forced displacement and humanitarian crisis, especially over the past 2 years. And the Yezidi Foundation was one of the first grantees that we have supported in Kurdistan region of Iraq, along with 2 more organizations that are working in the same territory, and 2 organizations working in Jordan. These interventions are implemented by womenist organizations who provide direct support services to women survivors of violence, and especially sexual violence as a weapon of war. In this year, we have also issued the call for proposal, and we're concluding it in this period, and we'll be supporting 5 additional organizations in 5 different regions of the world for an amount of approximately $2.7 million US. So our commitment in this field, and we do see that agency of women and agency of women survivors supporting other women survivors is essential in addressing this issue.
I have a bunch more questions, but I actually think we're running short on time, so I'm going to open it up to the floor. Perhaps we can take 2 or 3 questions at a time and allow the panelists to respond, and then we can take some more if time permits. So, Mavek, and then over here on Pablo.
Thank you. My name is Mavi Cabrera-Valeso from the Global Network of Women Peace Builders. My question is for Barry. In most of the countries and local communities we work with, for example, we just came back from North Kivu in DRC, where we work with young women peace leaders. And so we were training them on leadership, participation in decision making, and economic empowerment. It's mainly capacity building, but they insisted in us supporting them so they can actually have or start livelihood projects. And they told us, we know we're not going to get rich, but we'll probably, make a little income here and there. And that little income will change how our communities, including our families, are looking at us. And they equate economic security with personal security. Is this also a reality among women in the Yazidi communities? And what is their access to support so that they can, be more economically empowered? Thank you.
Just right in front of you, Maverick.
Hi, my name is Kelly. I'm also with the Global Network of Women Peace Builders, and I'll just really follow up to Maverick's question. And so we're doing, we focus on localizing women peace and security agenda in conflict and post-conflict regions. And my question is for Patty. What would you recommend for international organizations that are doing in-country programs on either gender equality or women empowerment to focus on, particularly to ensure that we are involving the Yezidi community and in particular Yezidi women?
Yeah, well, my colleagues from the from GNWP will be familiar with this, but following up on the trust fund, we also have the Women's Peace and Humanitarian Fund, which Iraq is the 5th country that will be funded through it. So we were funding already programs in Colombia, Burundi, the Pacific Islands, and Jordan. And recently, Iraq has become the 5th country. I think that's going to be 2 million, along the lines of what RED was saying in terms of comprehensive response, implementation of the National Action Plan, conflict prevention, and things like that. But so it'd be interesting it's really not a comment, it's just a point of information. I know that they received already some 96 proposals from NGOs working in Iraq on this, totaling about $14 million, and we'll only be able to fund 2 million out of those 14. And just a point of information. But.
So, the issue of investment and resources is just a topic on its own, because we can say everything we want to say. If there isn't resources that are being directed towards initiatives that impact and benefit women and girls, we're not going to get traction and the scale, achieve the scale at which we need to operate. So the issue of resources is actually quite important.
Two questions directed at you, but
so one of the questions was regarding empowerment of women and girls, livelihoods training, and so I didn't want to talk the whole time about Yezidi Foundation, what we're doing. We have a women's center where we do livelihoods training, we give women rights training, computer classes. We are contacting different companies who will invest in buying the things that the women and girls are making. And while they are going through that process of like learning new things, making new things, and at one point they should stand on their own feet, we give them also trauma treatment. Aside from that, the Free Yezidi Foundation is currently thinking with all the board members on what should we do to make sure that at least for now, while they are in the camps, what more training can we give these women and girls? And we are thinking of opening a bakery because there's no bakery near the camp, and a lot of women don't have a job. And I think learning, aside from a lot of livelihoods training and educational training that they already get from Free Yezidi Foundation, going for opportunities to get an actual job eventually is create the chances of getting a job. So we're also trying that. Aside from that, one thing that's very important to also mention, and thank you for the opportunity to do that now because you asked the question. With the UN Trust Fund to End Violence Against Women, we have already trained a group of women and girls in trauma treatment. All our staff are trained in psychological first aid, and now we have like a sort of brigade of 10 young women who go into the camp and start talking with the community, men, women, children, all of them, and see what's the level of the trauma, who needs more help, who needs to be directed to our specialists, the psychologists, and just to also mention, our psychologists are not from Iraq itself, because this immensely trauma that our community has, we do not think that basically the psychologists in Iraq are basically social workers. So we don't think that the social workers are able to take care of these victims. One thing I wanted to also go back, I hope I answered your question. One thing I also wanted to go back with what you mentioned is the children that are born from ISIS rapists. We have heard about, so as you said, and as I said, there's a lot of stigma against women and girls and that come back out of captivity. Yes, we receive them with open arms, but there's always some people in the community that will have a bad thing to say to our women and girls. The Free Yezidi Foundation does not pick any sides because there needs a lot of conversations with different people regarding this topic. It is not an issue that the Free Yezidi Foundation can solve immediately. But our foundation, our organization, our center is a safe space for women, Yezidi women and girls. Whoever comes there is in a safe space and everything is confidential. So nothing goes out. So all the women, and we have cases of women that want to keep their baby. So what do we do with them? Of course we give them treatment. They're equal like any other woman, and we don't judge them. And I think that is a step forward to eventually come to a thing where everyone is happy in the community. But one thing that's really important for the Free Yezidi Foundation is that our survivors are the people who are happy. Because at the end of the day, it's their decision. What they want to do, that should count for the whole community. So, I had another question. I don't think I really understood the question. Can you maybe repeat it again?
What are your recommendations to international organizations that are doing in-country work in Iraq, and how can they involve Yezidi community, especially?
Okay. So I will give an example, and then you can all judge for yourself. So we at Free Yezidi Foundation have experts from different countries, but we also have Yezidi people working with the Free Yezidi Foundation who are IDPs themselves, but it makes life a little bit more better for them. What we heard from Yezidis in the camp is, this is just one example of many. There was a small project done by an international organization where the people who were working there were, I can't remember if they international organization, bring people in who will judge my people, who will act in the same behavior as what ISIS is doing to our people, saying to the Yazidi women had to eat the food and the baked goods that were made by the teachers, but the teachers would not touch Yazidi food. This hurt our Yazidi community a lot, and they said we're not going back to that organization anymore. I thought, so now we have to open a bakery for the Yazidis and make food and eat it themselves. But it is that small. So my advice to any international organization, be aware that Yazidis are an ethnic religious minority group that have been suffering from these kind of things for many years. So if you want to go and work out there, make sure that you hire the right people that will not have, I think, prejudices against this minority group. Yeah, as I said, they need support. They don't need someone to say, like, I don't want to eat your food because, yeah, basically you're a Yazidi. So that's the only thing you have to really be aware of. Regarding the women, so we are very, very careful. Also, when we go for justice, we're very careful in who we bring in to make, we make sure that the women and girls are feeling comfortable. Also with the SRSG's office, when we brought some survivors to meet Rwandan survivors, we made sure that there was a psychologist. We made sure that there was a Yazidi person from the community who had lived there a long time before, so that the women and girls would feel comfortable. Make sure that they feel comfortable at your center, because then you have a safe space, and then you have a place where everyone wants to come. And then all of a sudden you have a whole list of people that want to participate. So that's really the advice that I can give you.
Well, there weren't any questions directed to me, but I just thought it's important to mention Security Council Resolution 2379, which requests the Secretary General to establish an investigative team, to appoint a special advisor. And I guess someone mentioned Mr. Karim Khan is here, and we are very privileged to have here amongst us. And I think, Pari, you expressed some concern that there has been no prosecution in Iraq or elsewhere, and you were mentioning the foreign terrorist fighters. And I just want to say that although the resolution does not really spell out what will happen with the collection of the evidence, because the mandate is basically to support domestic efforts to hold Daesh accountable by collecting, preserving, and storing evidence in Iraq of acts that may amount to war crimes, etc. It doesn't really say how it will be used, but I think there's an important, I think that is important for you to know, is that there's an important paragraph that underlines that the special advisor will also promote throughout the world accountability for acts that may amount to war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. So I think that's critical to make the link with the foreign terrorist fighters, and Mr. Khan has this mandate, and I do hope that Mr. Khan will have the opportunity to say a few words.
I think we can give him the opportunity now, actually.
Yes.
I think we could ask him if he wanted to. So, yeah.
Well, thank you so much, SRSG, and really thank you to you and women and Pari Ibrahim. It's an honour to be here today. In fact, I've only been in post for about a week or so, and so really trying to get computers and all these basic matters. But when I read yesterday the email that this event had been organised, in fact I should have been right now having a meeting regarding budgets and travel with the Chief of Staff of UNDP. And I said, no, I must come to this event, because leaving aside the substance, ultimately this is what the mandate is about. Not only the Yazidi victims, but victims of humanity that have suffered so violently and so awfully at the hands of Daesh. And it is that impunity that the Security Council seeks to address by way of Resolution 2379. I do feel fortified and really encouraged to see the four remarkable ladies at the top table. But looking around the room and hearing people for the first time, I can see that there are so many remarkable women in the room. I think one of the advantages of Resolution 2379 is that whilst we are independent and we are objective, we're not here to reinvent the wheel. SRSG Pamela Patton has been a trailblazer in already her role, if I can say so, in seeking to put forward test cases and seeking to be an advocate for those that don't have a voice. And really, if we're to succeed in this mandate whilst we are independent, we need the support of all different parts of the United Nations and all different parts of states and also other actors and groups, because the challenge is huge. And I think, again, SRSG Patton made a very important point. Complacency is extremely dangerous. We have seen in other contexts the adage of mission accomplished. And there is a fundamental and important distinguishing difference between the military defeat, or at least the secession of territory held by an armed group like Daesh, and the defeat of an ideology. What I will say is in relation to Nazi Germany, of course many acts of terror were committed, but to describe that full panoply of crimes simply under the rubric of terrorism would not have reflected the very particular and carnal nature of some of the crime and base natures of the crimes that were committed. And so these are aspects that we are required to have regard to under the resolution. So I look forward really to working with everybody in the room. We have to build a team, we have to get a budget, and we have to work together. But for all victims, and Hari Ibrahim, I know you and other colleagues in the Yazidi community, Christians, those that are homosexuals that were targeted, moderate Muslims, because in reality, whilst I have to conduct investigations, the truth really was that anybody that had the audacity to have independence of mind, had the audacity to believe that they had autonomy of choice, were targeted by a group that was fundamentally and abhorrently intolerant. And for them, we need to work together for accountability. So thank you for the privilege of being able to say a few words and to grace this very august event to remember the awful suffering that has been endured and still is being endured by the members of the Yazidi community. Thank you so much.
We have just a few minutes left, and we can take one more question. Sure, right over there.
Hi, my name is Ramya. I'm going to ask as an Iraqi woman. I know
right
that. Oh, thank you. I know that we have been working in Iraqi office with the government for the domestic law, because in Iraq, unfortunately, there is no domestic law, and any kind of violence that the women or children suffer, there is nothing to protect them. And whenever we go to the government, they tell us, unfortunately, we cannot approve the domestic law. And it had been set on the desk since 2014. And I'm sure till now it haven't approved yet. So if there is any opportunity to push on that, because at least whenever we will have a discussion on that, they say the issue there is the request for having a shelters for women. And because in Iraq, they don't want to approve it because of the shelter things. Regardless that when we talk to them, these shelters especially after ISIS, a lot of women, they can be in this shelter instead of staying in the camp because their families don't accept them after they have been raped. But still, it haven't been approved by the parliament, and there's 2 drafts, and they back and forth between the parliament with no approval. So if there is any way or any push to help to get this law approved, because it really can help a lot of women and children and girls who are suffering a lot, either by ISIS or even violence because of their families. Thank you.
So you're talking about the shelter laws?
No, it's a domestic law, but as part of it is the shelters for women.
What is the name of the law? It's on
domestic law.
Domestic violence.
Domestic violence.
Right. I mean, I think I will certainly discuss this with the team of experts and see if we can get a copy of the law, of the draft law, and we will contact the UN country team in Baghdad to try and get an English version. And lobbying for the enactment of this law, can be a joint initiative. UN Women, CEDAW, my office, and even the working group and others. But on the shelter, I just want to say that I was there. I actually inaugurated the first shelter in Baghdad, and when I inaugurated the shelter, I did make an address on the law, and UNFPA is really working hard on this law. So I think we will also try and contact UNFPA rep to see in terms of their advocacy work where are they, and also what are the obstacles to a prompt enactment. And I'm also I'm working with IPU, Interparliamentary Union, and I could also loop in the Interparliamentary Union and get the Parliamentary Women's Caucus in Iraq to also support us in our joint effort to advocate for the prompt enactment of this law.
And then, of course, also our regional office, our Middle East and North Africa office has as one of its responsibility addressing discriminatory laws, either enacting, repealing, or amending. So there is room to take this work forward. Here at HQ, Beatrice Duncan is the person. I think I have an appointment with her this afternoon, so I'll put this on the agenda.
But I don't think that right now the lack of legislation is an impediment to opening a shelter. I think what is required, because I know that UNFPA have plans to open shelters modeled on the one that was inaugurated in Baghdad. So it's about getting the resources, because I don't think, of course, it's always good to have an enabling legislation, but as of now, it's not an impediment.
Thank you so much. I want to give you all an opportunity to quickly conclude if there's anything that hasn't been said.
Well, I just want to reiterate maybe what Mr. Karen said, that we all have to work together. We all have to work together and to work for all the survivors. And from the perspective of my mandate, it also covers sexual violence against men and boys. I have met with different survivors from different components of Iraqi society, and I think we really have to work together. I have many partners in the room, but I think now more than ever before, it's critical that we work together. We support the investigative team that Mr. Khan will put in place. I think these are critical times, and we really have to mobilize resources and to mobilize efforts and work together.
Yeah. Well, thank Pramila for stressing the importance of working in a collaborative way, because we either become individually ineffective, or we collaborate so that we are all able to make a difference. I just want to emphasize the importance of empowering civil society as much as we can, something which the Trust Fund does, but I think there's room for more people to focus on creating an organization like FYF and supporting their work, because in many countries where government is unable to provide the protection and the services, civil society, especially women's organizations, are always the easiest and most people to collaborate with, and the most accessible institutions for women when their backs are really against the wall, because they have no interest in the status quo. Many of those organizations just want to do the best to support women. So I'm just, if you like, giving a shout out for civil society organization and the need for them to be supported.
Yeah, I think just want to thank everyone for coming here today, but not to forget that like what we came here for today is to remind you all of what happened 4 years ago, and remind you all that this is still happening, and that the fight for justice, the fight for making sure that women have rights, the fight for equality for different ethnicities of people in difficult countries like Iraq is always ongoing. And I'm very happy to see all of you here, but I want to also thank the UN Women team, the UNTF team, the SRSG's team, and the Global Justice Center, and of course my FYF team, for making this happen in a couple of days. You guys are all amazing.